Hello, and thanks for joining us on a special edition of Chicago Tonight. I'm Brandis Friedman.
And I'm Paris Schutz. Tonight is the latest in our series WTTW News, A Safer City. We're devoting our entire program to the issues of public and community safety.
We'll also be prioritizing public safety in our online coverage at WTTW.com/safercity. On tonight's program, we explore the persistent problem of homicides in Chicago and potential solutions. Here's what we're looking at.
Crime is falling nationwide, but Chicago's homicides are not declining as quickly as LA and New York. We look into why that could be.
Overwhelmingly, what survivors want are answers. Why my child, or why my husband, or why my loved one?
The challenges law enforcement face in solving homicides and the impact unsolved cases have on families.
And local organizations share how they're working to prevent crime in their communities. We'll kick off those conversations right after this.
Chicago Tonight is made possible in part by the Alexandra and John Nichols family, the Jim and Kay Mabey family, the Polk Brothers Foundation, and the support of these donors. Chicago Tonight's coverage of public safety is supported by the Su Ling Jin Charitable Foundation Initiative for Reducing Violence in Chicago.
Crime overall is falling nationwide, but the numbers on the most serious crime, homicide, show Chicago's cases are not declining as quickly as the two largest cities in the nation, New York and LA. Just why does Chicago lag behind the nation's two largest cities in homicide numbers, and what can the city learn from them? Joining us are Andrew Papachristos, professor of sociology at Northwestern University, and Caitlin Devaney, who is on the faculty in criminology at DePaul University. And joining us via Zoom are Jim McDonald, the former sheriff of Los Angeles County and now director of the University of Southern California's Safe Communities Institute, and Jillian Snyder, a retired New York City police officer, adjunct lecturer at John Jay College of Criminal Justice in New York, and policy director of criminal justice and civil liberties at the think tank R Street Institute in Washington, D.C. We thank you all for being here, and I've been wanting to look at this question for so long because I think this is sort of under-examined in the media. Comparing Chicago to New York and LA, if we can show that graphic looking at homicide numbers in 1990, Chicago 849, New York City more than 2,200, Los Angeles nearly 1,000. Look at how far New York City and Los Angeles dropped. Chicago dropped, but not nearly as much. Caitlin Devaney, is there any easy explanation for that?
Yeah, well, first off, so this is a number of sheer homicides and the count. So what we like to do in criminology, and what I think is a better analysis, is to ground it in population. So when we do that, now Chicago is still much above the rest, but we'd like to put them in a category with cities the same population.
Well, clearly the rates were similar in the 90s, and it seems like the rates in New York and LA went down much greater than Chicago.
Yes, it's true. We out of all the large cities, we have the highest homicide per 100,000 people. LA and New York has always done it much better than us. They've always been pretty low. We stand out with that, and I think when we look at why, we look at a historical policies of social isolation, of racial discrimination, of concentrated poverty that speak to numbers that have historically been higher than New York and Los Angeles.
Jillian Snyder, you were, of course, in the NYPD. What do you think the difference is between your city and what you were able to accomplish there and what's going on in Chicago?
I do want to just point out that Chicago is trending downward, so that is something that we should be looking at and applauding. Their numbers to date, as of last week, did go down. But looking at the NYPD compared to Chicago, we were really fortunate that we had Police Commissioner Bratton come on in the 90s and implement some of the most novel initiatives that policing had seen at that time. Broken windows methodology came out. We started really focusing on lower level offenses, quality of life offenses, because the point is not to over arrest, but instead to really put forth the collective efficacy that gives neighborhoods the reason that they want to keep their communities safe. And I think that NYPD was pivotal in that movement.
Jim McDonald, what about Los Angeles? A very large drop if you look at the long term compared to Chicago. What went right there?
You know, I look at where we were in Los Angeles back in '93, where we had just under 1,100 murders, I believe, and we finished up 2019 with 252 murders. That's about an 80% decrease in homicides in just one city, and yet nobody was talking about that. We should have built on the great foundation we had and continued in the right direction. And what we've seen since that time, post-2020 in particular, has been crime going in the wrong direction for reasons that were predictable. I think when you look at comparing cities for homicide, for violent crime, and for other crime, it's a nuanced situation, and I think there's a tendency to use it as a soundbite. But when you look at the police and what they've done, success or not so much, police are just one part of the overall equation. You've got prosecutors, you've got the judicial system, you have the political climate that you all operate in, what's enforced, what's not enforced, what's okay today, what that wasn't before, and vice versa. So you operate in an ecosystem and you do the best you can with what you have. But at the end of the day, if the police don't have the support of the public and don't get a fair shake in their mind from the media, the lack of engagement that you'll see is something that is fairly predictable. And we've seen that post-2020 in certain cities across America.
Andrew Papachristos, the part of the ecosystem is the socioeconomic status of these cities. Chicago's a very different city than LA and New York. Does that play into the difference here?
It plays very much into this difference. I mean, so in addition to some of the things I've already been pointing out around the criminal justice actions that happen in these spaces, New York as a city gentrified large parts of New York, massive parts of Manhattan. When we think about what Brooklyn and the Bronx looked like in the 1990s even, and we look there today, it's changed. It's still very segregated, but it's not as segregated as Chicago. And other changes that happened in Los Angeles, in addition to changing sort of income status, they were under a consent decree and changed a lot of the things that cities like Chicago are only doing right now. And we talked about the police efforts. The other thing that Los Angeles did very, very well 15, 20 years ago was bringing together sort of domains of public safety, right? So they had an office, the GRID office, which looked at bringing together, say, street outreach, law enforcement, and really coordinating things in much different ways that you're only seeing now in cities like Chicago. And one final thing we can't not say is that gangs in New York were never sort of as institutionalized as LA or Chicago. For stuff that they did in the 60s and 70s, they have gangs, they have crews, but what Chicago and LA looked like in the 90s was very different. New York is the weird one here. When you look at how they became safe, they're very, very unique, and they had a lot of things going on at one time.
Kaylin Devaney, are there lessons here that Chicago can take from New York or LA and apply it to the police department, to community organizations, or to the general political environment here?
I think just generally when I look at the history of policies in New York, they created housing policies in which they didn't put effort into concentrated poverty, racialized poverty in the way that we have. We have housing policies that that created housing in one area, it became concentrated, and then we moved out from there. New York didn't do it in the same way. So when we take lessons, it's how do we treat communities from a holistic way, then that becomes anti-violence. How do we treat them in terms of policy, healthcare, food, all of these policies that holistically are anti-violence approaches.
You know, Jillian Snyder, when we talk about Chicago in national media, it kind of gets tagged with being the murder capital of the United States, but it's pretty erroneous because when you look at per capita, as we've talked about, it usually doesn't even crack the top 10. So in terms of per capita rate, Chicago is not as violent as maybe some portrayals of it are.
No, you're absolutely correct. There's actually, the most recent studies have shown that Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chattanooga, Dallas, Nashville, Memphis, those cities, if you're looking at it and you are controlling for population density, Chicago is lower than all of them in terms of violent crime and homicide rate.
And Jim McDonald, is there a difference in terms of how all the cities are reporting these numbers? I know there was a new sort of system put in place by the FBI in recent years.
Yeah. The FBI in 2021 had asked that everybody be on board. It's a voluntary system. Everybody wants to comply with it. It's the National Incident Reporting, the NIBRS, the National Incident-Based Reporting System, to replace the Uniform Crime Reports, which go back almost 100 years. NIBRS would be more inclusive of crimes. It would count all crimes, not just the primary crime in a particular incident. It can address as many as 10 crimes in capturing the data on that. The challenge is it's much more labor intensive to be able to input the data necessary to be able to get the results you want to get and get that granular level of detail. And what we've seen prior to 2021, when it was supposed to be completed and everybody be on board, we didn't see that. We saw about 60% or so of the departments on board, so that you had two different criteria being used to be able to capture crime data. The problem was, and it wasn't that people didn't want to be on board, it was resources. Recruitment and retention became a big issue post-2020, both on the professional side of the house and the sworn side. And so there was a hesitance there to be able to pull people off the street in some cases to be able to get this job done. And it didn't become a priority of that nature. We still have the issues with recruitment and retention as we move forward. So challenges just in the logistics of being able to get that done, but we're moving in the right direction.
And Andrew Papachristos, we talked about how pretty much most cities have seen a drop in homicides since the spike in the pandemic year. Is that something that Chicago can hang its hat on, or is it just kind of just happening irregardless of policy?
No, I think Chicago's put a lot of effort into actually Chicago started putting a lot of effort in 2016, even before the pandemic, in its community violence infrastructure. And in fact, those dividends, I think, paid off during COVID. And one of our, part of our team's analysis showed, that we have a set of organizations that have contributed. The rates would have been much higher had they not been in place. So it's hard to imagine a world without COVID. We can't do that. There'll always be a little asterisk. But what we know is if some of these things weren't in place, there would have been more homicides. There would have been more shootings.
And going around during COVID, I went to reporting in each of the neighborhoods to see how many community organizations are there and active. No doubt that they make a difference in terms of putting a dent in those numbers. We could talk about this all show, but we have to leave it there. My thanks to Jim McDonald from LA, Jillian Snyder in New York, and then here in Chicago, Caitlin Devaney at DePaul, and Andrew Papachristos from Northwestern. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There were 617 homicides in Chicago last year, according to the city's police department. Many of those cases can go unsolved, leaving families in limbo. Reporter Joanna Hernandez joins us now from Pilsen to share one mother's journey to getting justice and the challenges in solving these crimes. Joanna.
Paris, that mother's son was Kobe Puga. The 21-year-old was shot and killed here last year. His mother has been looking for answers ever since by trying to understand the legal process and the layers it takes to find the person who killed her son.
En mi mente pienso que va a regresar. No sé, pero ya después reacciono y digo, me pongo a llorar, digo, ya no lo voy a tener, ya no lo voy a volver a abrazar.
Maria Puga shares pictures of her youngest son, Kobe, who was killed October 14th last year.
Que la persona que mató a Kobe no supo ni a quién mató. Porque Kobe para la familia era una pieza bien fundamental. Es una persona muy bonita, la verdad. Luego yo digo, pues no sé por qué le hicieron daño a mi hijo.
Maria remembers her son as a car enthusiast. She says he often spent hours in the garage taking cars apart and rebuilding them.
Por eso, porque digo tanto que cuidé a mi hijo y cómo le quitaron la vida así.
Police say 21-year-old Kobe Puga was killed in a drive-by shooting. According to police, it was around midnight when Kobe was shot multiple times near 19th Street and Paulina in Pilsen.
Pues estaba aquí en la casa, se bañó. Nosotros estábamos aquí en la sala, platicando con él. Y nos dijo que iba a ir a entregar una pieza del carro y ya después se iba a ir a cenar.
Kobe never made it back home. As the case remains open, his family is left to cope with the trauma, a process Catherine Bocanegra has dedicated her work to understand.
Overwhelmingly, what survivors want are answers. Why my child, or why my husband, or why my loved one? Why did that bullet hit the person who I love? What was the motive behind it? What were the circumstances? And they want accountability. So families want answers and accountability, and they have to rely on a process that they cannot control.
Bocanegra has worked alongside families who have lost loved ones to gun violence.
Establishing safety is one of the hardest things for families who've lost loved ones to violence. I would say the second part is definitely going through the criminal legal process of a homicide investigation.
Over the years, the Chicago Police Department's homicide clearance rates have declined. In most cases, clearing a crime means police have enough evidence to prosecute and charge at least one suspect. In 2014, nearly 40% of cases were closed for homicides involving firearms. Last year, that number was close to 20%. Retired CPD Chief of Detectives Eugene Roy says several factors go into investigating a shooting and homicide.
One of the systemic problems is the fact that the Chicago Police Department has only assigned 7% of its sworn complement of police officers as detectives. Now that's being compared to New York City and Los Angeles, which both have 14 to 15% of their sworn officers assigned as detectives.
Another critical factor that Roy says affects the pace of investigations is not having enough police officers.
Officers in the beats are going from call to call to call.
The community sometimes plays a big part in solving a case. Roy says people who witness a homicide are often reluctant to talk to the police because Cook County does not have a witness protection program. For years, city leaders have called for one. Bocanegra says it would be an essential tool for detectives and families seeking justice.
Legislation was passed to fund our witness protection program at the state level. And now there is a grant available for local law enforcement agencies to be able to apply for those funds to implement a witness protection program. Those are two important steps. The third step, however, is incredibly critical, which is we need to educate the public on this opportunity.
It's been nearly 5 months since Kobe Puga died, and despite a $15,000 reward offered for information, the family is still waiting for answers.
Quiero que agarren al responsable que le quitó la vida a mi hijo. Yo pienso que no me va a regresar a mi hijo, pero voy a tener a lo mejor una paz, tantita paz, porque diario lloro. Digo, yo sufriendo, la persona que le quitó la vida a mi hijo anda como si nada en la calle.
Through Bocanegra's experience, the path to obtain justice is different for every family.
Justice involves systems change. And I heard this from many family members, is that justice involves changing the way that detectives interact with the families, that prosecutors interact with families.
Long Live Kobe stickers with an image of a car can be seen along 19th Street, a reminder of a day that Maria says changed her family's life forever.
Me da coraje, frustración, porque digo, ¿cómo le fueron a quitar la vida a mi hijo con tantos sueños? Y ahora el problema es que a mí me dejaron destrozada, a toda la familia.
And regarding the pace and success of these investigations, former Detective Roy also mentioned it would be beneficial to have a department where the state's attorney and detectives have a location to work on cases from day one. Reporting from Pilsen, I'm Joanna Hernandez. Back to you, Brandis.
Joanna, thank you. More than 80% of homicides in 2023 were on Chicago's south and west sides, according to city data. A deeper look shows West Garfield Park with 48 homicides in nearby community areas not so far behind. Local organizations are focusing on these areas to work directly with those most impacted in an effort to stop cycles of violence. Joining us now are Adam Alonzo, CEO of Build Chicago, and Mika Battle, the executive director of Bridge to Feed Freedom. Thanks to you both for joining us. Adam Alonzo builds programs. You work with a lot of youth, obviously. Give us a sense of why working with young people serves to reduce violence and homicide rates in the community.
We're building partnerships. We're building friendships. We're getting to know young people through their entire developmental sort of continuum, right? And the more you have time to interact and engage and listen to a young person, you help them to navigate some of the tough parts of life of just growing up. Being a teenager, if we think back to our times, was not an easy time. And young people growing up today really need someone by their side as a mentor. And so Build really focuses its work thinking about how soon can we actually meet them, walk with them side by side, connect with their parents, uncles, grandparents, whoever may be in the family, so that it's we're as a team working together to help this young person be their best.
How do you work with kids who may have already experienced some trauma to help them recover?
Sure. First and foremost, just to be there to listen, to see how they're feeling, what they're thinking. We connect obviously through our clinical department as well for those who need counseling, but sometimes it's just someone to listen. We provide them a lot of different activities because that can be therapeutic in and of itself. We use art as a tool, as a therapeutic tool as well, and oftentimes we find young people who are sitting there with a brush or a pencil in their hand can actually start to unlock some things that they feel comfortable talking about with one of the mentors who's there in the art room with them. But it's important to also tread lightly, right? Because you don't want to have them relive all of the feelings. And trauma is not something you can just knock on the door and ask someone to open up and share everything that's happened, because it is hard. And so you carefully wait to whenever the young person feels ready to start to share, and you just do little bits at a time until they gain confidence and feel different and better, and ultimately work towards healing.
Mika Battle, on the other end of this spectrum of people that you work with many formerly incarcerated people who are re-entering their communities. Give us a sense of what the challenges are for those individuals and what they're experiencing when they come home.
Well, they're experiencing homelessness. Many don't have families and clean environments to go back to. So Bridge to Freedom is the catalyst or the place for this. So we provide housing for men and women who come home from prison. And with that housing component comes anger management, lifestyle redirection, trauma therapy, drug rehabilitation, workforce development, resume writing, and as I heard them saying over at Bill, we also do art therapy because sometimes it's easier to talk about what happened to them in an art or in a spoken word or journaling or something like that. 8 out of 10 people who are behind bars had drug addictions. They either were high when they committed their crime or they committed their crime to get drugs. So the drug rehabilitation part is very important in our rehabilitation and reducing recidivism for the people.
So obviously it sounds like a lot of wraparound services are necessary there. Mika, what are some of the factors that might lead to recidivism for people who are re-entering?
What is some of the I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
What are some of the factors that might lead to recidivism?
Well, drug addiction, traumas unresolved traumas that didn't get resolved. So like I said, we do the trauma therapy, not being able to find a job, education. We also have a GED program. We have an online college course, and we also have apprenticeships for like carpentry, electricity, plumbing, baristas because we have a coffee shop, and stage hands because we have a theater, and writers and different things like that. Employment is a big barrier as well.
Okay. Adam, Build is in the Austin neighborhood. We were just discussing the big, beautiful new building that you all have. But West Garfield Park, which is a community area not too far, that is actually the area that is most impacted by homicides last year. And of course, we could also talk about the misperceptions about Austin as well. But how does violence and homicides in one neighborhood or one community impact a neighboring one?
Sure. Absolutely, because the neighborhoods are right next to each other. And so you have people who are going from one neighborhood to another, either to commit an act of violence or hiding back after they've done that, right? And so I know that we have several programs in a lot of elementary schools there to really try to lay down some roots there and to help support families and young people. One of the elementary schools that we're at actually experienced a couple of homicides that happened during a school day. And that, if you think about the act of trauma, and now you're being locked down in your school and you can't go outside, and there's a large police presence. These are all things that you have to really work on while they're earlier on. So when Mika gets them, they're coming out from having spent time incarcerated, but at no point did anyone really try to help mitigate some of the trauma that they felt, right? So when you think about the full spectrum from us, we're trying to work through them early on and through their teen years and beyond, and Mika's picking them up after they've had a long stint perhaps, and that all the trauma that's built up from being incarcerated added on to the fact of what's happened to them, maybe getting to that point of incarceration. So it really does take all of us to work together regardless of the neighborhoods that these things are happening in.
Mika, we've got about a minute left. What are some of the resources that you need to support your work?
Some of the resources is always funding, grant funding, donations, funding, and networking and wraparound services like Build and other places that can employ them or give them resources or help to train them. And also mentors. We need mentors and churches to be able to welcome them and not judge them when they come home, to be able to work with them and make them, instead of being menaces to society, to become citizens in society, because they are returning citizens.
All right, a lot of work coming from both of your organizations. You've got your work cut out for you. Thanks for sharing with us what you do, Adam Alonzo and Mika Battle. Thank you so much. And we're back to wrap things up right after this. And that's our show for this Monday night. Be sure to follow our ongoing public safety coverage online at WTTW.com/safercity.
And join us tomorrow night at 5:30 and 10. And now for all of us here at Chicago Tonight, I'm Paris Schutz.
And I'm Brandis Friedman. Thank you for watching. Stay healthy and safe, and have a good night.
Closed captioning is made possible by Robert A. Clifford and Clifford Law Offices, a Chicago personal injury and wrongful death firm that is proud to be a multilingual law firm that provides translators for a variety of languages.